This is me taking off carelessly. Not very elegant, huh? Don't be fooled by my smooth getaway. That's me flying away in shame. Now why did I take off all uncoordinated and disheveled? Real helicopters don't take off like that. Did I do something wrong? Not directly, obviously, but there's something in real life that helps a helicopter pilot take off that's not modeled in the sim. Those of you who watched my live stream already know what I'm talking about, but I'd encourage you to watch this video anyway, as I cover it in more detail, and again, I find it interesting. After that, I'm going to teach you guys how to take off with more nuance and grace than I just did, in light of the limitations of our sim. As I mentioned in the live stream, all helicopters have some kind of suspension system. For this 407, it's as simple as a wide-angled set of skids that flex. And yes, it's nice to have a cushioned landing so you don't have to try to land like a feather. Microsoft models the ground and the chopper like two inelastic objects colliding. Bouncing off or hard jarring landings are almost inevitable. In real life, the helicopter suspension takes up the last few inches of landing, making the collision elastic and relatively smooth. It absorbs and dissipates the energy from the impact, which would otherwise have nowhere to go but a hard bounce. Now here's a more detailed look at what it looks like. Now with the back of the helicopter open and exposed, we can take a closer look. The white cylinders at the bottom here, the horizontal white cylinders, that's not a shock absorber. That is actually the horizontal portion of the leg that comes out, and this vertical piece is the shock absorber. It connects at the top to the helicopter body frame, and where they join, that comes out at an angle on the outside. It is the leg that sticks out, the strut. If you pull down the fiberglass shroud, you can see the hole through which that bent leg comes out. That hole allows the leg to move around with the shock absorber attached. And when the helicopter takes off, the legs droop very much like the wheels on a car on a lift droops when it's being lifted up. In my simplified graphical representation, the leg is a single bent piece that sticks out of the helicopter through a wide hole in the hull. It pivots at one end at this hinge point, anchoring it to the helicopter chassis, and its movement is cushioned by this shock absorber. This is repeated 4 times as essentially 4 strut independent suspension. And as cool as that is for landing, what's really interesting to me is its role in takeoffs. When you're taking off, if you are not centered, the helicopter will lean without ever leaving the ground. It's telling you to center up, so when you finally do leave the ground, you don't look like a complete noob. I could be wrong, but it seems to me there are 3 distinct stages to a helicopter takeoff. First, developing enough lift to overcome the weight of the helicopter. Second, the transition from ground to hover. Third, actually leaving the ground. That second stage, the transition, is not really modeled in flight sim, or modeled incompletely might be more accurate, and it's what's responsible for this. So now let's take a closer look at Mr. D's takeoff in more detail. There's a moment where he raises the collective, tests for the helicopter's readiness to take off by wiggling the cyclic, and begins the takeoff process by increasing lift and centering up before he leaves the ground. That transition between being on the ground and being in the air is where he corrects any inclination for the helicopter to veer off out of control. You can see in this transitional stage the helicopter is even displaying signs of wanting to twist or yaw on him, which he quickly compensates for and stops. If you time it, he has about 3 seconds to center up before he's in the air. By the time his skids actually leave the ground, it's basically a technicality because he's already in a stable hover. That's not what we have in the sim. Although Cowan Sim does us the courtesy of animating the skids just like the real thing, they're not really a functional simulation. The transition from ground to hover is not of an elastic deformation of suspension, but the physics of 2 inelastic solids separating from each other. There is a transition, but it's not like the real thing. Now that's not to say that you can't take off with nuance and grace. You can't really use the transition as your centering opportunity, but like Mr. D testing the helicopter's takeoff readiness, you can use the end of stage 1 to center up. So let's take a look at what that looks like in the sim. We'll put up all the views on the screen here, the cockpit, the collective, the cyclic, and pedals. Bring the collective up slowly and test for the helicopter's readiness to take off by wiggling the cyclic. From the cockpit view, you'll actually see the environment move around ever so slightly if the helicopter is becoming, quote, light on its skids, as they say. Because you don't really get the benefit of a proper transition phase, you have to wiggle side to side and front to back to confirm that you're pretty close to center. If one side doesn't wiggle that much, it probably means you're leaning away from that side and you should move your cyclic towards it and wiggle again. Correct any leans before you completely lose touch with the ground. This is where the sim gets it wrong. In the sim, you will actually lean the entire inelastic aircraft object, lifting a skid to determine that you're not centered. In real life, the suspension is telling you that. I remember one time when I was with Mr. D, we were taking off and the helicopter was leaning forward just a little bit, like in the sim, except we didn't break ground contact. The suspension provided that lean. In the sim, you rock to one side like a goofball, and that's sad. It's sad, and it's my criticism to Microsoft. Let's face it, flying helicopters is hard. That's the appeal, in my opinion. Straight and level flight is the easiest part of the flight regime. Landings and takeoffs are two of the hard parts. And it makes it so much worse when they don't model the suspension. I know the suspension doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's one of the reasons flying a helicopter is artificially harder in the sim than in real life. Now don't get me wrong, flying a helicopter is a pretty unnerving experience, not for the actual flight controls, but for all the other aspects that make it unsettling and dangerous. But in the sim, modeling the suspension would at least make the flight dynamics more realistic and less awkward. So to reiterate, when taking off, come up slow on the collective, wiggle the cyclic, center up, continue increasing lift slowly, stabilize into a rising hover. And my final recommendation, complain to Microsoft that they need to model helicopter suspension for the sake of realism and accuracy. That's all I have to say about that. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. I hope I was right. And until next time, may the feeling of that rotor wash over you.
Huh? Yeah, boy.
Yeah, boy!